Hello everybody and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast for this week. I'm your host Jez FM. The Magical Learning Podcast is a podcast that looks at important topics in business and life and presents them in a fun and lighthearted way. We like to have a bit of fun with our learning. We want to make sure it sticks, and the best way to do that is to have a bit of fun. And today is certainly no different. We are back with the regular team to talk to David Fish. David Fish is a author, keynote speaker, facilitator, coach, trainer, pilot. But what we know him best is as a strategy coach. He is fantastic, and we're going to talk about real brands and how their strategies work. Brands like Xero, MYOB, QANTAS, Rex, and Red Bull. What their strategies are, how he looks at them, and some of the things he likes and some of the things he doesn't like. This is a really good one if you want to know a bit more about how to actually find the strategy that'll work best for you, how to narrow down your strategy and target market, or how to broaden it out. If you want any of those bits of information, this is a great conversation. Plus, he's funny as. So enjoy our conversation with the awesome David Fishy Fish, and have a magical week. Hello everybody and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast for this week. Yes, we have a guest this week, and I'm sure you would have seen that already in the title, but we'll get to them very shortly. Let's check in with the regular team though, because we've got them both in the mobile recording studio, that is the car. So Jeanette and Graham.
Our week's been really good, Jez. I've done a bit of travel, lots of requests for quote this week, so I've been doing those as well. And yeah, generally great weather, which is starting to feel like spring. So super excited.
Yes, you can. I think you can see the smiles on everyone's face. The spring weather's definitely coming in.
And over to you, Graham.
Over to moi. Hello, everyone. So welcome to the stationary mobile recording studio that doesn't work. I've had an interesting week. I've been dealing with bureaucracy in large telecommunications organisations for part of the week, so that's been fun. Said no one ever. But we are in downtown Wagga Wagga, Wiradjuri country this morning, and the sun is peeking out through the clouds. Birds are singing. Snakes are still sleeping, so, you know, life's pretty good right now.
Well, I mean, it is good. We're in that very nice period where there's some sun and there's no snakes. That is true. I also wanted to mention, this is slightly snake related, but this week my story is that I bought one of these eggs that makes this sound. You know, that people use for percussion, but that could be little rattlesnake energy for people that a snake aligned. So anyway, I've been playing with that this week, just really acting like a high school music teacher or something, trying to get the class involved. So very exciting. David Fish, our guest, how are you going this week?
Fantastic. Thank you. I've also had a bit of travel. Been down in Melbourne this week, back in Sydney today. Got back last night. I've been doing some training this week with a media company. It's my sweet spot training, so how we tell stories as businesses, which we're not very good at doing. We might even touch on that today. Been a good week actually, and then I've got coaching calls with a few clients today as well. So busy run to the end of the week, but I'm excited for this conversation after having a great week.
Well, we're so glad that you could squeeze in the conversation as well. So we're going to probably be calling you Fishy throughout this conversation. I think it's just time to rip that Band-Aid off. So David Fish, Fishy, same person. Fishy, do you want to tell us, for people that are just being introduced to you, a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my background strategy, and specifically in the advertising space. So I started out client side in the UK. I went into agency. I've worked on the media owner side, so what was Austereo, now Southern Cross Austereo, and then back into agency, always in those strategic roles. And if I look at my work, and I guess leading into what we're going to talk about today, everything I've done from a very early age through to today has been around how things show up in the world. And my work today is around how we show up in the world, so how we actively shape our presence, how companies show up in the world, and how they position themselves for growth, which is becoming, in my view, increasingly important as our attention spans and distractions continue to get in the way of how we connect and make meaningful relationships as businesses attracting and working with customers. And then the third pillar of my work is how ideas show up in the world. So that presentation piece, how do we get our ideas out through the medium of PowerPoint, which we all have to work with, which is not set up for clear, concise, and compelling presentations, and telling beautiful, flowing stories. So they're the three layers. If you look at it as a triangle, at the top is purpose work. So how we show up in the world is very purposeful work for me. And then down in the bottom, that sort of ideas piece is what I call the volume work. It's where I work with large sales teams with 100 people and do training programs. So that's my world. So everything I do is how things show up in the world. And if something isn't showing up, unfortunately for me, it stands out like a sore thumb. Whether it's an ad where I'm like, oh, that message doesn't work, or something I see on a shelf, I'm like, oh, that's just lost. I just go through the world, seeing how things do and don't stand out.
Well, that is very helpful, Fishy, because I think that, certainly myself, I struggle to sort of understand how things, should work in this space. And I'm not like you. I don't see these things standing out. So it's great to have a lens that's actually going to highlight these for us so we don't make these mistakes. Now, you've just touched on a little bit before we get into the conversation. The topic today, you sort of sent me a couple sentences, but I've condensed it down into standing out and showing up in the world, which is kind of two of the key themes that I was interested in from that sentence. So before we get into today's conversation, did you want to tell us a little bit about how you kind of came to this topic?
Yeah. So it's that middle pillar for me, how companies position themselves to show up and to stand out. One of the reasons I think this is really important, and will come up as we talk, is that we often go to the standing out part. And this appears in lots of spam emails in my inbox. Need to stand out. Standing out is an outcome of how we show up. We often go to the marketing, we go to the identity, we go to the advertising, we do more EDMs, we shout louder on LinkedIn to try and stand out. But actually, when the way we're showing up, who we are, how we position ourselves, the story that informs that, the customer we want to talk to, and the associations we create for that customer, that's the stuff that actually matters. And we can call that strategy if you like, we can call it whatever we want. It's how a company shows up. If we get clear on what it is that company wants to be positioned for, the execution doesn't just become easier, it becomes more effective. And so for me, the showing up piece is around how should we show up before we go out in the world to try and stand out. And standing out is getting harder. There is no question that we are fighting for attention. It is harder to get attention. It is harder to keep attention. Distractions are increasing through the devices that we're surrounded by. The number of podcasts that we have to consume, the amount of stuff we have to wade through on LinkedIn to get to something interesting, distraction is abound. So this need to get this right is becoming, for me, increasingly important for companies to stop wasting money on stuff that doesn't work.
That is a great insight, Fishy. Well, I think that's just primed us right for these first questions. So I think we've got to kick it off. Danette, you are first cab off the rank. So do you want to tell us what your question was and why you chose it?
So Fishy knows me well, and he knows I have a curious brain, so I always ask more than one question. So my first question and the tail end of that one is, what is a great example of a company that stands out and stands apart in the world, and why, from your perspective, it is a great example? Then I'll come to the second sort of question.
Cool. Amazing. So I'm going to share a consumer brand example, and actually it came up in one of the other questions, or I mentioned in one of the other questions, which was Red Bull. And I've worked on Red Bull. I've actually worked on Coca-Cola, Red Bull, and on Lucozade Energy, and they kind of all overlap and compete. So I have a reasonable perspective on this one, although I'll talk about it more from a consumer perspective. And then I'll give a couple of B2B examples. We can talk about Xero and MYOB. B2B examples are harder just because they have a narrower audience, which is a good thing. But we often don't see the work if we're not in that sector. So sometimes my B2B examples don't land. So let's start with Red Bull. And one of the things, if we think about Red Bull, it's super consistent in what it stands for and what it believes in. So if we go back to its origin in 1987, when Red Bull came onto the scene, it was what was called a functional drink. Now, marketing yourself as a functional drink is pretty dull. And it couldn't and didn't want to be just refreshment. Refreshment's been owned by Coca-Cola since 1886. They came out with delicious and refreshing. That's where if you look at the very first advertising for Coca-Cola in 1886, it says delicious and refreshing. And they've owned refreshing and refreshment ever since. So Red Bull made a very conscious decision to be about more than refreshment and this functional piece around extreme and extreme energy. You get a lift from Red Bull. Now, what's interesting about Red Bull is they've never had to say energy in their advertising. So if you Google Red Bull advertising and look through the years, they don't use the word energy but everything they do positions themselves as a drink that gives you more than other drinks. It gives you this energy through, gives you wings, lifts you up. And everything they have done, including their advertising, in terms of how they bring that advertising message to life, but everything has been consistent and true to that from day one. They stand for being a drink that gives you more, and they're very clear on who that is for. They're not trying to be anything that they're not. And so I think as a consumer, we feel that. And what happens is when you see that blue can with the silver, with the Red Bull on the shelf, and you don't even need to see the Red Bull. If you have if I showed you blue and silver hashed on a tall, thin can, you would go, that's Red Bull. That's how that brand stands out. Now with Zero and MYOB, if we go into the business space, we'll take a slightly different lens on this and we'll talk about relatability. Zero to me is a brand that is relatable to me as a small business owner. It positions itself as being clean and simple, and everything it talks to, both messaging, but also in its identity and how it shows up in my world, is suggesting that it simplifies things. And the way that I use that product is to simplify my bookkeeping and to help that relationship between me and my accountant to get stuff done and stuff that I'm not a specialist in. And so it speaks to that in the way that it communicates, and therefore it feels very relatable to me and the needs that I have and the things that I'm trying to do. MYOB, I believe, is a similar product, but I actually have no idea what they do. Nothing that they do connects with me in any way whatsoever. Now, this is where we have to be careful about judging people's strategy when we don't know what the strategy is. For MYOB, that they may be going out of their way to alienate me. I may not be the customer that they want, and that is fantastic. If the strategy is, let's reach under 30s, people running influencer businesses on TikTok and Instagram, people like Jez running podcasts, and we want to appeal to an audience that is not me, then everything they're doing is spot on. And that's where, just because it alienates me doesn't mean it's wrong, and I should judge it for being wrong, because I don't know the strategy that sits behind it. But if the strategy is that I am their customer, then everything they're doing is missing the mark. And they have a massive issue in the way that they are positioning themselves to attract me as a customer. So that's my caveat on B2B, is that we don't know the strategy. But in terms of execution of those two products, if they're both targeting me as a small business owner, one is absolutely spot on and one is missing the mark.
Love those examples, Fishy. Thank you so much. So my next question then is, why is it important to tell your unique story as a business?
So I talk about this in the how we make a business distinctive. And the story really is the start of what makes a business distinctive. If we think about it, when the company started, now that might have been last week and it might have been 100 years ago, the company was created to do something. And when I work with founders, this is often a lot easier than when I work with businesses that are 100 years old and they've had 42 CEOs, and actually why the business started has been lost in the history. But when we go back to why the business started, we start to understand what mattered, what people believed in, what they saw as the problem, what was the inspiration behind creating a product, challenging the status quo, doing something different. And when we can find that through line to how that is true to how the business shows up today, we get a narrative that gives us substance. And that, when we bring that through into how that informs what goes out into the market, we feel that substance in the communication. We feel that when a CEO stands up on a stage and talks about, this is what we believe in and this is why we're doing what we're doing. It's not that we have to tell every part of the story. So understanding a company story isn't that we then have to create the about us section of a web page, or sometimes we don't have to, and we shouldn't talk about being 100 years old. It's not the right positioning. But going back over 100 years gives us the inclination of why this business started then and what's true about that today, that gives us this congruency. We feel substance, and we also feel shallow, and we feel fake really fast. And so when we create a story that's not true, as a consumer interacting with that, we feel that. And that's never how we want someone to feel when we're standing up and speaking, when we're creating a marketing message, or we're writing a post. Anything that we're doing to put the business out in the world has to come from a place of substance. And what the story does is it aligns everybody in the business to a single unifying narrative. We get clear on why this business exists and what it stands for, and then that informs everything we do, so we get this congruency and we get consistency. When you've got one story, I've got another story, I think 100 years matters, I've got no idea what happened 100 years ago, that plays out in how we show up in the marketplace.
Thank you so much, Fishy. They were brilliant answers. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, great stuff and great questions there, Danette. Well, let's stay in the mobile recording booth. So, Graham, what was your question? Why'd you choose it?
I have no idea, to be honest. I mean, let's be honest. It's Friday. How would I know what I was thinking 2 days ago? I guess in the yeah, I'm only partly not serious. I'm just curious about. I remember listening to an interview with the CEO, and I can't remember the company, but she's a very, very switched on person. And one of the comments that she made about businesses and how we position ourselves in the market today, to your points about how we show up, is essentially the marketing. But she was talking about one of the, it might have been Forbes or I don't know, Inc. magazine, somebody's like top 20 business list. And the point she made was that the companies that were on that list 10 years ago almost exclusively are not on that list today. And if you look at any top 10, top 100, a large number of those companies in 10 years' time probably will have disappeared or who are just not there anymore. So my question was around, given everything changes so quickly, and it's not that we've never had change, we've always had change, it's just the pace. And it seems to be becoming a lot harder to predict the direction of the change. I define this idea of people who are experts in AI, I find that astonishing, but I'll leave that for another day. So how important for a business are things like awareness and agility? So the awareness piece partly is, I guess, goes back to, well, who are we? Or who do we want to be? How do we want to position ourselves as a business? And also, how does the market see us? How do our potential clients and our existing clients see us? So that's probably the awareness piece. And then the agility is, I guess, how well prepared are we to be able to pivot if or when we realise that the direction we're going in is no longer relevant, or that our clients' needs have changed, or we're actually working with, or we're talking to the wrong clients and we should be talking to another group. That was a really short question. And that brings us to the end of our podcast for today, folks. Thanks for joining.
Welcome
Brilliant.
to our podcast, Fishy.
I love it. But what I love is the end of your question had the answer to your question. So customer needs. Customer needs is the answer to the question of how do we stay relevant? How do we stay in the top 10? And what's the awareness that we need? The awareness we need is what customers need. How does the business meet the needs of the customers, and how does it show up in a way that the customers can recall that company first when it needs that help? That's what makes the difference. So how we position ourselves against and in the context of a problem that we solve. And what happens is problems change. And so as a problem that the customer has changes, as a business we have to adapt how we solve the evolving customer need. And when businesses start to fall out of that top 10, top 100 and then disappear, it's because they don't keep up with the changing needs of the customer. If we take the overused example of Kodak, but it's an easy go-to, we stopped needing cameras that would fit in our pocket because we had a phone with a camera on it. And so the need for a small camera which had a small roll of film that was easy to pick up from a newsagent disappeared, and therefore the business became irrelevant because it didn't evolve to meet what the customer needed next. And so, and actually, like a lot of things, we go back to some of the things we had before, because now one of our needs in photography is to have pictures we can put on the wall, and the iPhone doesn't give us that. And so we go back to wanting instant cameras. Now, if Kodak had positioned itself against a revised consumer problem, which is, hey, this is great, you've got this thing in your pocket, but you can't do anything with the pictures, it could have created a new market in a space where it was already an expert. But not keeping up with the customer is typically where we start to fall behind the market. And some of that is other people disrupt the market. So Uber disrupted the taxi industry, but it did that by understanding the customer need. We had a frustration with the taxi industry, which is, I don't know if it's going to turn up. When it turns up, I don't know if the driver knows where they're going. I don't know what this is going to cost until I get to the end of the route. And I've got no way of giving feedback on the experience that I had because no one cares. So all of that is tension. And Uber said we can solve all of those problems. And that disrupted the taxi industry. So now the taxi industry needs to respond with what is the customer problem that now exists in the new market. And if we don't address the new customer problem and understand what the customer needs in the marketplace, we start to become irrelevant.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, amazing. So many interesting things and insights there, and I'd never really thought about that Uber versus taxi one in those specific terms before, but that really makes a lot of sense. Well, I might jump to my question here. Speaking of businesses, and today my question was this. When a business sets up, it may think of itself as a B2C or B2B, but I wonder how often people consider how their business shows up in the world. How do good businesses actually show up in the world? And I think you've touched on this a little bit, but all of your insights around this have been very interesting, so I want to hear more.
It's a great question. So one of the things is, in answering this, it's really important that companies take the time to do this. So actually think about how are we showing up in the world. And I think the longer you're in the business, the harder this gets. So the longer you're inside a business, the harder it gets to be a customer outside the business, to see the business as though you're experiencing it for the first time, which many customers are. So I actually have a diagnostic I can give you a link to where companies can answer a series of questions and get a score across the 3 areas that I think are most important. But the simple questions I would ask, and I would ask this of customers. So if I'm in a business and I want to understand how I'm showing up in the marketplace, I'd ask customers what associations they have with the work that we do. So what do you associate us with? And you're looking for things like, oh, you're playful, you're fun, we see you doing this. We're starting to understand the perception of the customer versus how we perceive ourselves. A second question to that is, who do we compete with? Now, this often really surprises people. Who you think your competitors are and who a customer thinks your competitors are will show you the context in which they see you showing up. It will show you the problems that they think you solve relative to somebody else. And that gets some really interesting responses. Another one of my favorites is, what's the value we deliver for you? And another way to frame that is, what's the impact if we weren't here or we didn't do this work? If the company I run disappeared, what's the impact to you as a customer? And we're looking for not just the answer, we're looking for their reaction. So how mortified are they that if we could go out of business and not serve them anymore? The stronger that reaction, the greater the value we're providing for them, the more fear there is that we don't exist and there's no one else to do that work. So the more unique and differentiated our value proposition is. If they're like, don't care, then we don't have a strong value proposition, and that's a problem, right? And you can kind of, if we want to just play that game, you can frame this with friends, right? If you've got people in your lives who you really depend on, then you ascribe high value to that person. If there's people in your lives you're like, don't care if they're there or not, well, it's the same. We have low value in that relationship, and businesses are the same. We want that attachment. We want to feel like we belong in their world and we add value into their world. So asking them to give you a sense of what they lose if you're not there starts to unpack that value proposition. How do you see the work I do bringing value to your business? And then looking for the words they use, that you help us do this, without you we couldn't do this. That's the value. They're the problems you solve and the value you bring to that customer. Then that can come back into the business, and often there's some really surprising answers in there for people who've been in businesses for a while. They're like, wow, we thought we were in the accounting software business, and actually we were in the simplification business. We're in the ease and helpfulness business, not the accounting software business. Things like that. Now then what that leads to is, how do you position yourself against help and simple as opposed to accounting software? Someone isn't looking for accounting software necessarily, they might be looking for help with bookkeeping. They're different frames that then leads to how your messages show up in the market to resonate with that audience.
Yeah, wow. So many good insights again. I am flying down this page, just writing notes as fast as possible, Fishy. So this has been a really good combo. I might jump into Allegra's question, which we have touched on a little bit, but I do want to kind of get your additional thoughts on this one, which is, she wrote, what makes some businesses stand out? One example that comes to mind is Red Bull. What is it doing to stand out?
So there's 3 things that I look at in terms of how a business effectively positions itself to show up in the market. The first is relatable. So showing up in a context that makes sense to the customer so that that company feels like it belongs in our world. That starts with knowing who the customer is. One of the big mistakes many customers make is they try and be for everybody or a broad audience segment. And the fear behind that is the fear of missing out on money, the fear of being too narrow, of the market not being big enough. So there's ways of assessing that. But when we're too broad, we dilute our message. We cannot ever be for everyone. There is not a single business in the world. I keep putting this challenge out there. There is not a single business in the world that I have found that is for everybody. And someone went, oh, funeral directors. I'm like, no, not ready yet. There's not a single business in the world that is for everybody right now. So your message as a funeral director is, for the people who need you next, not for everybody, because it doesn't resonate. It's not relatable. So this knowing the customer, what do they need in the moment, and how do I create associations, and how do I show up in a context that positions me against the problem that I solve? That's the first part. And that starts to identify value, but we need to go further with value because that's kind of rational value. It's important, but it's rational value. Differentiation is the next piece. So differentiated value is what are we prepared to speak up for? What do we believe in terms of driving change for customers? So this is less about what we do and grandstanding about look at how great we are and look at how many features we've got. And it's more about why this matters to a customer. So if someone's on a stage, if I use that as an articulation of this, the story that we should be telling should be the story of change for customers. We should be passionately going out into the world and saying, we believe as a business, this is wrong and this is a better way to do things. And by working in this way, you achieve this. That's how we position ourselves for being distinctive through speaking up for the value we deliver in the world. And there are some people who do this really well. Love him or hate him. I'm going to use Elon Musk and SpaceX as an example here. When Elon talks about SpaceX and the need for reusable rockets and the wastage of putting things up in space and then just blowing them up on re-entry into the Earth, you get the sense of there is a better way to do this. And as a business, i.e. NASA, as a company buying into a business in the future, when someone talks about we can make reusable rockets that make space travel 1/3 the cost of the current way of putting things into space, then you get that differentiated value. If I'm making non-reusable rockets and someone comes along and goes, and this is true of Uber as well, when we look at Uber versus taxis feel outdated and Uber feels modern. The value in Uber is through its positioning of there is a better way of doing mobility. Now, it doesn't have to say that, but that's what it believes in, and that comes through. The third part to this is being distinctive in the story. So this comes back to that story piece we talked about with the net. How does that story that really defines the business and that captures what we believe in and why we started now come through the business and out into our identity? We often start with identity because it's the thing we see, it's the closest thing to us. We get to make a logo, we get to choose a font, we get to make some nice graphical things. And it's the worst thing we can do because when identity is disconnected from all of those other things, it's superficial. It's just an Arial font wrapped around a bit of clip art. It's not how we become distinctive in the marketplace because I can create the same logo you've created and then it becomes a logo competition of who's got the best font. What we need is to position ourselves distinctively through who we are and what we stand for and why we exist in the world. And if you do this work, then how you show up as an identity, and I call it signature icons, becomes obvious. The Qantas tail is a signature icon. If I showed you a picture of a kangaroo on a red tail, you would go, that's Qantas. And the story behind that is this is the airline that brings Australian home. If I go to Rex has run a 737 service between Sydney and Melbourne with an aeroplane that says our heart is in the country. It's taken regional positioning from a loyal customer and transferred it into a metro market where that doesn't make any sense. And then it hasn't stood up and said, this is why we're doing this. We believe in challenging Qantas and Virgin. We believe that there is a better way. We believe that Australians travelling between Sydney and Melbourne, blah, blah, blah. It's never said that. It's just said, there's an aeroplane. It's going from here to there, and our heart's in the country. I have no reason to engage with that. I have no reason to believe that that's offering me anything different to what currently exists in 2 very good Sydney-Melbourne services, 3 if you include Jetstar. And so, for me, there's some very clear lessons in Rex and Rex's failure to do with how the business showed up in moving into a new market.
You know, Fishy, I think a great tagline for Rex would be, here's an aeroplane. I think that does actually feel quite resonantly strong.
And then where you end up when you don't do this work well, you end up in price. Now, if you are built as a low-cost business from day one, and your foundations are a low-cost business, then you can win in price. If you're a business moving into a sector and you end up in price, you'll fail. Because you're trying to run an expensive business on a low-cost model, and the business isn't set up to run a low-cost model. And so when you don't do this, the default becomes discount. And there's only one way that discounting ever goes. And so for me, the positioning is a defense against, it's a value play, not just value for customers, but it's how we retain value in the service that we're selling into the marketplace, to defend against having to discount and to maintain a premium and price position in the market, because people understand the value we bring and are prepared to pay for it. QANTAS is a premium product, but when you sit in an overseas airport and you look out the window and you see that red tail, that says Australian going home. And you'll pay for that.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I think speaking of this, I think this leads really nicely into Kanika's question. So I'm just going to ask that one because it kind of looks, I guess, at some of the difference between Rex and QANTAS, which is what prevents businesses from wanting or trying to stand out?
Knowledge and fear. That's the simple answer. Knowledge, not being clear who the customer is. The fear of not being too narrow. Not Simon Sinek. I'll come back to him. We want to get to the smallest viable audience. Seth Godin, that's who said this. Seth Godin came up with this smallest viable audience. Viable is important. So the smallest viable audience is what's the least number of people that if they buy this product, I will make money. So the viable part is important because we have to make money. You can go too small. And so what drives the audience not being specific and tight and well understood and the market well defined is that fear of going too small and and missing out on opportunities. The next is the fear of standing out and the conviction behind being clear of what to stand for. It takes a degree of bravery, but it also takes a little bit of work to, let's call it a stage, stand up and say, we believe in this. But what it does is it gives customers confidence in your conviction. And this is where we get the emotional connection to value, which is really important in B2B situations because for the customer, there is the fear of getting it wrong. Why should I buy this product? Why should I move? I'm going to be judged for making this decision. I'm the business owner and I'm not standing up for that product. Why would you stand up for it? Why would you make a case internally to move to my company if I'm not prepared to stand up for what I believe in? But in the company, we're fearful of making a stand for something in case that alienates somebody. Well, we need to alienate. This is my thing with MyOB, whatever they're actually called. If their positioning is to alienate me, fantastic. That is an awesome piece of customer work. If they've gone, you know what, Fishy is a zero customer, his type of business, him as a demographic, that's not for us, then the way they are going to market is brilliant because they are making a position that says you are not my customer. Ryanair in the UK, low-cost airline, very outspoken CEO, but he says, if you expect customer service, don't fly with Ryanair because you're not paying for it. Super clear on what they stand for. Many businesses are fearful of doing this, but it holds back the business because it doesn't put you out in the market with that distinctive position in people's minds. You're not making a claim for what you stand for. And then we touched on identity, forgetting the past, ignoring how it can and should play a role, and then making identity the default. So getting caught up in making marketing messages, producing posts. It's really interesting for me because I spot brand identity changes. And often if you see an identity change, then I'll look to see what else has changed, and often it's nothing. And so it's kind of plastering over the crack. You know, we just put a bit of wallpaper over the crack and the crack disappears, but it doesn't. Eventually the wallpaper splits. That's kind of identity. It's super close to us. We see it. We see our logos. We see our websites. We're like, oh, that feels dated. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Doesn't matter. What's behind the reason for wanting to change it? Get that bit right, then change the identity. So we get very superficial with identity and we plaster over some things. There's a great quote which is, if you've got a bad product, the best way to fail it fast is to advertise it. So fix the product, understand who it's for, understand the needs of the customer, then advertise that. if the product's a bit rubbish, the minute you put it out into the marketplace, it will fail real fast. It's just a really expensive failure then, because you've got a bad product and you've spent money on it.
I feel like, you were talking before about how some brands, their hooks really get into you in a bad way when you see like a bad bit of branding or whatever at the start. I feel the same way. I do stand-up comedy, and when I see bad stand-up comedy in TV shows where it clearly would not work in front of an audience, everything in me shakes that this is just not right. So I just think before we jump into our last question, did you have any things that when you see them, you go, this is not good?
That's probably another 3 podcasts. The things that grate are messages that don't make sense. So when there's just something, and I'm like, it's overcomplicated, and I'm actually going to... So I'm going to call out Telstra for the current campaign. If you've seen their outdoor campaign, they've got the little bars, and they've got words in the bars, and it's quite small in the big outdoor campaign, or big outdoor site, which is quite expensive. And it's a bit too clever. So I get it. It's about signal, and signal matters for maps and gossip and all the things. I think it's just a bit too hard to fit. Like it's outdoors fast, right? Outdoors like a business card that flashes in front of your face, and you're supposed to just get it. And so now at the same time, they're running the characters on television, and the characters don't feel anything like the coloured backgrounds with the little bars on outdoor. So who are you right now, Telstra? I get you're about, and I also go, Signal. I get the Signal piece with Optus and Vodafone, but I think it's known. I don't think it's something that needs to be so heavily communicated. So I'm confused by it. Now, I overthink these things because I've now already spent more time on Telstra's advertising than any other consumer has. But that's the problem, is that consumers are not spending the time trying to figure it out. And so therefore I just go, this feels like it's an award-winning campaign that's not serving customers. Like it's about the marketing team winning awards and accolades and doing great work that they feel proud about, but it's not actually driving business outcomes. So things like that really stand out to me, where the message just is overcomplicated or doesn't make sense. Ads without voiceovers don't work. We're distracted. So if you're going to run any kind of visual ad, so anything online or on television, particularly if you're going to spend money on the most expensive time slot, which is around news, people are doing other things when the news is on. It's called cooking, feeding kids, feeding dogs. They're not eyes on the television. So if you run an ad with no voiceover, you're wasting 30 seconds of time because people are not taking in your message. So things like that. But yes, we could do a whole podcast on the things that makes Fishy angry, about how companies show up in the world, because there's quite a lot of them.
Well, that sounds like a great podcast. I would actually love to listen to. Fishy. What makes Fishy angry? Fishy's rants of the week. Well, I see it. Let's dive into this last question quickly here, which is from Marg. And Marg's question is, if someone was planning to launch a new business, what are some things that person could focus on and make sure they get right that other businesses may miss?
So I would go to, why does the world need this? Obsess about that over everything else. How does it help? What tension, what barriers does it remove or resolve? Why are you doing this? Not why are you doing this for you? Why are you doing this for somebody else? And then who really values that? So this smallest viable audience that Seth would talk about. If you could sell this to one person and they give you enough money to make the business viable, who would that person be? And then are there 3 or 4 of those people? If you sold this to 10 of those people, is that enough? That's your market. And now be super focused on market to those 10 people. And that will create a ripple, and there'll be 100, and the 100 will find 1,000. Understand, first and foremost, why does the world need this? There's a lot of product in the world. There's a lot of messages in the world. There's a lot of PowerPoint in the world. Do we need any more? Like, why are you making this? Uber came into the world and solved a problem. Airbnb solved a problem. Obsess about the problem you're solving, and then obsess about who are you solving that for. Do literally just let that keep you awake. Then do logos and websites and marketing and all the other stuff. That should come from that stuff. So the minute you're tempted to go and go, oh, we need a logo, don't. Why am I making this? Who is it for? Why am I making this? Who is it for? Why do they need this? What problem does it solve? Why am I making this? Who is it for? Oh, we need a logo. No, we don't. Just keep going back to those 2 things above everything else, because as a new business, you have the ability to get super tight on that before you do everything else. And then if everything else you do is informed by that, it will be amazing.
Fishy, I know you were saying before that, if you don't do that, you can end up with just in a logo battle where you're literally just picking between fonts. What is the best font?
So you know what? Arial gets a really bad rap. But Arial bold works brilliantly on web. There's no fancy curly bits. You've got quite a lot of range. And actually, if we talk about fonts, if you look at Facebook, Google, we won't talk about Twitter. Facebook and Google, and I think Apple did this as well, all tidied up their logos to work better on mobile. So when we do look at identity, when we do look at fonts, when we do look at websites, obsess about mobile. Because mobile is where most interactions are going to happen at some point. And so not having a identity and a website that works on mobile is a huge mistake. But obsess about that after you've got a product that people need and you know who needs it.
Fantastic. Well, I might grab some final thoughts on the conversation today. And I think I'm going to start here with Graham. Graham, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation and sort of standing up and standing out in the world?
So many. I'm I guess a little disappointed that Comic Sans didn't get a mention in the font discussion. Interesting term. It's an oxymoron all by itself. There you go. I didn't have the opportunity to take a lot of notes, but I think for me, just some of the core sort of messages throughout the discussions, for me, a lot of it, again, comes back to why do we exist as a company, as a business? Like, why are we here? And as long as we can continue to have some clarity around that, David, to your point about don't worry about the logo on the website and everything else, get really clear on who you want to talk to. Going back to Seth Godin about the idea that you can't market to everybody and nor should you try, but getting really, really crystal clear on who your target market is, and then just stay focused on that and be consistent. And yes, I absolutely want to sit in on the other podcast that Jez mentioned about what ticks Fishy off during the week.
We have to have you back for that one, Fishy.
That's probably that'll be like a choc top and popcorn session, but I suspect.
Yeah, I feel it could be a bit stand-uppy.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Graham, and great questions today. Danette, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation, standing out and showing up in the world?
Really loved all of the conversation, the examples, etc. And I really liked your point right at the start about we often try to stand out first before we work out how we show up. And so that importance of understanding, what is the problem we solve, who are we solving it for, and making that at the core of everything we do. And as the market changes and the needs change, that we need to be out there talking to the customers to actually understand how they perceive us, what value we deliver to them. And I just loved your examples today. So, Fishy, as always, extraordinary. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Danette.
Yes, and I mean, I've taken about 3 pages worth of notes, and really that idea of, there's so much that can be diluted and distilled from this, and I think that QANTAS tail idea versus Rex, I think you've done a lot of good contrasting with Zero and MYOB, where you can kind of really start to see those things. I've got a potential name for the podcast. It could be sort of playing off Flying Fists of Fury, Flying Fish of Fury, but we'll see. The alternative I was thinking was School of Fish, but look, we'll work these out later. Fishy, did you have any final thoughts on the topic standing out and showing up in the world?
What are my final thoughts? I haven't been very succinct in my answers today. Play with this, have fun with this, right? I don't think we spend enough time actually thinking about our business within the business. We're running so fast, running businesses and marketing businesses. Stop the marketing and get down into the strategy. Stop making stuff. You've probably got enough. Just figure out what it's all doing and how it all joins together, and have some fun with it. This is fun work. When you actually get into playing with why do we exist and what's our story and how do we get here. just spend some time on that. Like, you can be a team of 2, you can be a team of 200, and have some fun exploring these topics and seeing what comes up, and then being surprised by what you can do with it. So don't make this hard work. This should be a fun part of the business.
Great. Well, I'm sure people have been listening to this and want a few more of your insights. Where's the best place for people to learn more about you, or do you have any resources that you recommend for people?
I've been writing a lot recently, so davidfish.com.au is my website. There is a downloadable white paper that has just been published. Printed versions, if you want one, you can email me. There's a PDF version if you're an electronic person. I like printed things because I like giving them out, and I like bending things and sticking post-it notes on things. And I do have a diagnostic for this very topic, so you can be profiled against how relatable you are, how distinctive you are, and how differentiated you are. And as well as a score, there's a automatic set of insights produced against your score, so you can see some of my suggestions of things that you could do to change. And if you just drop me an email, fish@davidfish.com.au, I can send you a link for that. It will be on the website in the coming weeks as well.
Fantastic. Well, all those will be available in the description, so if anybody from MYOB or Rex is listening, maybe give that a go. I want to say thank you so much, Fishy, for being on today. Danette and Graham, wonderful questions, insights, and great shares today. For everybody that's been sharing this podcast, thank you very much. It's been growing nicely. And as always, everybody, have a magical week.